Patrick Tanner built his identity around his extraordinary looks, thriving on the admiration of strangers and relying on his quieter, overlooked best friend Anthony to serve as the contrast that made him shine brighter. While Patrick lived for the spotlight, Anthony lived in the margins, until one night at a club, everything shifted. Patrick Tanner lived with the unshakable conviction that he was the most handsome man alive. It wasn't just vanity. It was a daily observation. In nearly every room he entered, women, and more than a few men, tracked his movement with a mixture of admiration and genuine awe. His best friend, Anthony, existed on the opposite end of the spectrum. Anthony seemed to have been born with a face that repelled attention rather than invited it. Yet deep down, Patrick was more than okay with that. He took a quiet, selfish comfort in being the sole sun in their solar system, while Anthony remained a shadow that only served to make Patrick's own light burn brighter. The neon hum of The Gilded Lily pulsed against the sidewalk as Patrick and Anthony stepped out of the car. Patrick didn't just walk, he performed. He adjusted his silk lapel, a gesture that caused a group of women standing in the velvet rope line to go momentarily silent. "Stay close, Aunt," Patrick murmured, though he didn't look back. "The crowd looks thick tonight. I don't want you getting lost in the shuffle." "I'm right here, Pat," Anthony replied, his voice flat. He kept his head down, hands shoved deep into his pockets. He was used to the parting of the Red Sea that happened whenever Patrick approached a door. As they reached the front, the bouncer, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of granite, barely glanced at Patrick's ID. He simply unhooked the rope with a respectful nod. "Right this way, Mr. Tanner." Inside, the atmosphere was a thick soup of expensive cologne and loud bass. Patrick didn't even have to find a table. The table found him. A hostess led them to a prime booth in the VIP section, her eyes never once drifting to Anthony, who followed like a stray dog in the wake of a king. Patrick slid into the center of the plush leather seat, spreading his arms across the backrest. Within seconds, the gravitational pull began. A cocktail waitress appeared with 2 drinks they hadn't even ordered yet. "On the house," she whispered, leaning in closer to Patrick than was strictly necessary for service. "The manager noticed you joined us tonight." Patrick flashed a grin, the one he knew hit like a physical weight, and watched the girl's breath hitch. He took a sip of his drink and finally glanced at Anthony, who was sitting on the very edge of the booth, almost invisible in the dim purple light. "See," Patrick said, his voice dripping with a patronizing warmth. "Told you it was a good idea to come out. Everyone's having a great time." Anthony looked at the crowd, then back at his friend. He saw the hungry eyes of the room locked onto Patrick and the smug, satisfied glow on Patrick's face. Anthony just nodded, a small, unreadable smile touching his lips. He was the only person in the room who truly saw Patrick, and Patrick was too busy being looked at to notice. The bass continued to thrum, vibrating the ice in their glasses. Patrick was in his element, holding court without saying a word, simply letting the ambient light catch the angles of his jawline. Then she approached. She was dressed in a sharp, understated blazer that looked out of place among the sequins and silk of the club. She didn't have the wide-eyed, breathless look of the others. Patrick instinctively sat up a little straighter, flashing the level for a smile, the one he reserved for people who looked like they had high standards. She walked straight to their booth, but her eyes didn't even graze Patrick. She stepped right past his extended personal space and leaned toward the edge of the table. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was clear, cutting right through the music. "Are you Anthony Miller?" Anthony blinked, startled. He looked up, his face shifting from its usual blank mask to a look of genuine confusion. Yeah, I am." "I thought so," she said, a small, genuine smile breaking across her face. "I'm Sarah. I've been following your architectural blog for months. Your critique of the new Civic Center's structural geometry was brilliant. I've been trying to solve that load-bearing issue in my own sketches for weeks, and your sketch finally made it click." Patrick's smile didn't drop. It froze. It was the expression of a man who had been told the punchline of a joke he didn't understand. He cleared his throat, a sound meant to redirect the room's gravity back to its rightful center. "I'm Patrick," he said, offering a hand with a practiced, charming tilt of the head. I'm the one who usually handles the social geometry around here. Sarah glanced at his hand, then at his face, with the same polite, brief interest one might give a nice piece of wallpaper. Nice to meet you, Patrick, she said quickly, before immediately turning back to Anthony. Anyway, Anthony, I didn't mean to interrupt your night, but I saw you from across the room and had to say something. Are you still working on that series about brutalist restoration? I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Eastgate project. Anthony sat up, his shoulders uncurling for the first time all night. A spark lit up behind his eyes, a different kind of glow than the neon lights. Actually, I just finished a piece on the Eastgate's foundation issues yesterday. Patrick sat there, his hand still hovering near his drink, feeling a sensation he hadn't felt in years. He was the background character. The ride home was uncharacteristically quiet. Usually, the interior of Patrick's luxury sedan was filled with his play-by-play analysis of who had looked at him, who had tried too hard to impress him, and how the energy of the night had revolved around his presence. Tonight, the only sound was the low hum of tires on asphalt. Patrick gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, his knuckles a shade whiter than usual. He kept glancing at Anthony out of the corner of his eye. Anthony wasn't slumped over or hiding in his hoodie anymore. He was staring out the window with a faint, contemplative shadow of a smirk. So, Patrick finally broke the silence, his voice a pitch higher than its usual smooth baritone. Architectural blogs. You didn't tell me you were still doing those. I never stopped, Pat, Anthony said simply. I just didn't think you'd be interested. It's mostly technical stuff. Load-bearing capacities, brutalist aesthetics, not exactly club talk.
Right.
Technical. Boring stuff, Patrick muttered, though the word boring felt hollow. He adjusted his rear-view mirror, catching his own reflection. He looked perfect. His hair was still flawlessly swept, his skin clear, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass. But for the first time, he felt like he was looking at a high-definition photograph of a person who wasn't actually in the car. She was intense, Patrick added, trying to regain his footing. A bit niche, right? I mean, she didn't even notice the VIP table. Probably one of those types who spends too much time in libraries to appreciate the real world. Anthony turned his head, looking directly at Patrick. The ugly features Patrick usually pitted seemed different in the dim glow of the dashboard. They looked settled. Grounded. She saw the real world just fine, Pat, Anthony said softly. She just wasn't looking for a statue. She was looking for a conversation. Patrick's jaw tightened. He hit the turn signal with a bit more force than necessary. I have conversations. I talk to people all night. You let people talk at you, Anthony corrected, his voice devoid of malice, but heavy with truth. There's a difference. As they pulled up to Anthony's apartment, Patrick didn't offer his usual "see you tomorrow, buddy," or the patronizing slap on the shoulder. He just watched as Anthony hopped out of the car, moving with a newfound lightness. Patrick stayed idling at the curb for a long time, staring at his reflection in the mirror, waiting for the admiration to come back. But for once, the most handsome man alive felt completely invisible. The silence of the following week was louder than any club Patrick had ever stepped into. For Anthony, the time apart wasn't a break, it was a breakthrough. He spent his evenings hunched over a drafting table, his desk lamp casting a warm circle over blueprints and half-empty coffee mugs. For the first time, he didn't have to check his watch to see if he was making Patrick late for a social appearance. He wasn't the ugly friend in the corner. He was a lead architect on a new restoration project. His inbox was full of emails from Sarah and other colleagues, and for once, his face didn't matter. His mind was the main attraction. Patrick, meanwhile, was unraveling in the most aesthetically pleasing way possible. The solo walk on Thursday night, Patrick dressed with his usual precision, a charcoal turtleneck that made his eyes pop and a tailored coat. He went to their usual upscale lounge, expecting the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with being the center of attention. He stood at the bar, his profile perfectly angled toward the room. People looked. They always looked. A group of socialites whispered as they passed, and a photographer for a local lifestyle mag even snapped a candid shot of him holding a martini. But something was wrong. Usually, after a woman complimented his smile, Patrick would glance at Anthony to catch that look of awe his friend had. He needed Anthony to be the 0 to his 10. Without Anthony there to ignore, Patrick realized there was no one to actually talk to. The people approaching him weren't interested in his day, they were interested in his vibe. He realized that his entire personality was built on being the handsome one in a pair. On his own, he was just a man standing by a wall. By 11 p.m., Patrick was sitting in his car, the engine idling. He scrolled through his phone. He had dozens of unread messages from people wanting to grab drinks, but not a single one from Anthony. He checked Anthony's blog, something he'd never actually done before. He saw a new post titled, "The Integrity of Hidden Structures." He didn't understand half the terms, but he saw the comment section. It was thriving. People were debating, laughing, and engaging. Patrick looked at his own reflection in the rear-view mirror. For the first time in his life, his own beauty felt like a heavy, boring weight. He was the sun, sure, but he was realizing that without a planet to shine on, he was just burning out in the middle of nowhere. He missed his underdog, and the realization that the underdog didn't miss him back made him the saddest he had ever felt. The silence of his penthouse was finally too much for Patrick to bear. The high-end finishes and floor-to-ceiling windows, which usually felt like a trophy case, now just felt like a cold, empty box. He had tried 3 different outfits for a solo dinner, but looking in the mirror felt like staring at a stranger. Desperate for a voice that didn't just tell him what he wanted to hear, he dialed his mother. "Patrick, honey? It's nearly 10 o'clock. Her voice came through, warm and steady. "Is everything all right?" "I don't know, Mom." Patrick sighed, pacing the length of his Italian marble floor. I'm feeling off. Anthony's been busy with his architecture stuff, and I went out tonight, but it was hollow. I feel like I'm disappearing." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that only a mother who knows her son's heart can hold. "Patrick," she said softly, her tone shifting into that of a gentle but firm counselor. "You aren't disappearing. You're just finally seeing the shadow of the idol you've built out of yourself." Patrick stopped pacing. "What does that mean?" "The Bible tells us that charm is deceitful and beauty is vain," she quoted, her voice filled with a mother's concern. "You've spent years feeding your vanity, Patrick. You've used Anthony as a backdrop to make your own image shine brighter, instead of seeing him as a brother made in the same image of God. You've been living for the admiration and awe of strangers, but those things are like mist. They vanish the moment the wind changes." "I just feel so empty without the attention," Patrick admitted, his voice cracking. "That's because vanity is a hungry sin, son. The more you feed it, the more it demands. You're feeling blue because you've made yourself the center of your own world, and it's a very lonely place to be. You need to stop looking in the mirror and start looking for ways to serve others. You need to ask for forgiveness, not just from the Lord, but from Anthony, too. You've treated his friendship like an accessory, and a person's soul is never an accessory." Patrick sat down on the edge of his bed, the weight of her words hitting harder than any rejection at a club ever could. "I don't even know how to talk to him right now," he whispered. "Start by listening, Patrick," she advised. The next morning, the sun streamed into Patrick's apartment, hitting the polished surfaces and gold accents. Usually, he'd spend this time on a 20-minute skincare routine, admiring the glow. Today, he just splashed cold water on his face, barely looking at the glass, and picked up his phone. His thumb hovered over Anthony's name. His heart was hammering, a strange, jittery feeling he usually only got before a high-stakes photo shoot. He pressed dial. It went to voicemail. Patrick let out a shaky breath, feeling a familiar sting of ego, but then he remembered his mother's voice. Humility is the only cure. He waited an hour and tried again. This time, on the 4th ring, a distracted-sounding Anthony picked up. "Hey, Pat? Sorry, I'm right in the middle of a site survey. Is everything okay? You don't usually call before noon." Patrick swallowed hard. He had a dozen charming openings ready, jokes about how bored Anthony must be without him, but he pushed them down. "Everything's fine, Aunt," Patrick said, his voice sounding uncharacteristically grounded. I was thinking about what you said the other night. About that Eastgate project." There was a long silence on the other end. Patrick could hear the faint sound of wind and construction in the background. "You were?" Anthony asked, his tone guarded.
Yeah.
"I realize I didn't really let you finish your thought," Patrick said, gripping the phone tight. "I was too busy being, well, myself. I wanted to see if you had time for lunch later this week. No clubs, no scenes. Just a quiet spot. I actually want to hear about the foundation issues you mentioned. I want to understand what you're working on." Another pause. Patrick held his breath. He felt naked without his vanity to protect him. "I'd like that, Pat," Anthony finally said, and Patrick could hear the guard lowering. "I'm actually heading to the site office now, but Friday works. There's a little deli near the firm. It's not exactly VIP, but the coffee is good." "Friday is perfect," Patrick said. "And Aunt, I'm proud of you."
For the blog and
"All of it."
thanks, man.
"I'll text you the address." As Patrick hung up, he didn't feel the rush of 100 admiring gazes.
He
Just felt a quiet, steady peace. He looked at his reflection in the hallway mirror one last time before heading out, not to check his hair, but to make sure he looked like someone who was ready to listen. That Friday, Patrick was already seated at the deli, having spent the last 10 minutes subtly checking his reflection in a polished soda machine. He had mentally rehearsed his humble opening, prepared to be the magnanimous friend who was finally ready to listen. But when the bell above the door chimed, it wasn't just Anthony. It was Anthony and Sarah, walking in mid-conversation, their shoulders nearly brushing. Anthony was gesturing animatedly with his hands, his face lit with a confidence Patrick had never seen in all their years of club hopping. "Hey, Pat," Anthony said, pulling out a chair for Sarah before sliding into his own. "Hope you don't mind. I ran into Sarah at the firm, and we were right in the middle of debating the Eastgate structural integrity." "I practically followed him here," Sarah added, giving Patrick a brief, polite nod, the kind one gives a waiter, before immediately spreading a rolled-up schematic across the table, covering Patrick's folded hands. "Anthony, look at the cantilevered support on page 4. If we use your suggestion for the load-bearing pivot, we can save the original facade." Patrick's humble game didn't just stumble, it hit a brick wall. I thought it was just going to be us," Patrick said, his voice coming out thinner than he intended. He tried to reclaim the space, flashing that famous, symmetrical smile that usually acted as a tractor beam for attention. "But the more the merrier, right? I was just telling Anthony I wanted to learn about the big buildings." Sarah didn't even look up. "It's architecture, Patrick. And it's not just big buildings, it's urban psychology." She tapped a point on the blueprint. "Anthony, your blog post on the brutalist restoration was cited in the department meeting this morning. Did you see the email?" Anthony's eyes widened. "Seriously?" The senior partners read it. The two of them leaned in, their heads hovering over the blue and white lines, speaking a language of geometry, stress loads, and aesthetic honesty. Patrick sat back, his expensive sweater feeling suddenly itchy. He looked around the deli. A few teenagers at the counter were whispering and looking at him, but for the first time in his life, their gaze felt like a consolation prize. Inside this circle, the only circle that mattered right now, he was a ghost. "I actually have a very strong sense of aesthetic," Patrick interrupted, his ego surfacing like an air bubble in a pressurized tank. "I've been told my eye for proportion is..." "Patrick, hold that thought," Anthony said, not unkindly, but without looking up. "Sarah, if we pivot the load here, does it compromise the glass?" Patrick felt a hot prickle of shame. He was the most handsome man alive, sitting at a table with a woman who treated him like a piece of furniture, and a best friend who had finally found a world where Patrick's face was the least interesting thing about him. His mother's words echoed in his head. A person's soul is never an accessory. He realized then that he wasn't just losing his status as the alpha, he was losing his place in Anthony's life because he didn't know how to be anything other than a centerpiece. The silence from the table was the loudest thing Patrick had ever heard. He sat there for another minute, his heart drumming against his ribs, waiting for the commercial break, the moment where they would realize they were ignoring the main attraction and apologize. But the moment never came. Sarah's finger traced a line on the schematic, and Anthony nodded, his face lit with a fierce, intellectual hunger that Patrick didn't know how to feed. "You know what?" Patrick said, standing up so abruptly his chair screeched against the linoleum. Anthony finally looked up, blinking as if coming out of a trance. "Everything okay, Pat?" "I just remembered I have a meeting," Patrick lied, his voice tight. He adjusted his jacket, the fabric feeling like a suit of armor that was 3 sizes too small. "Something with my stylist. It's a whole thing."
Oh.
"Okay," Anthony said, his gaze already drifting back down to the blueprints. "We'll catch up later then?"
Yeah.
"Later," Patrick muttered. He didn't look at Sarah, mostly because he knew she wasn't looking at him. He turned and marched toward the door, his chin held high, his stride practiced and runway ready. He pushed through the heavy deli door, expecting the cool air to feel like a relief. Instead, as he stepped onto the sidewalk, he felt a crushing sense of irrelevance. He walked past a mirrored shop window and instinctively slowed down to check his profile. He looked perfect. Every hair was in place. He was still the most handsome man on the block. But for the first time in his life, looking at himself didn't make him feel better. He looked at his reflection and saw a beautiful, empty store with nothing on the shelves. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over his mother's contact again, but he couldn't bring himself to call. He just stood there on the street corner, a masterpiece that no one was looking at, while the unattractive man inside the deli was finally the center of the world. Desperate to feel the familiar warmth of being adored, Patrick scrolled past the club promoters and gym buddies in his contacts until he landed on Elena. Elena was a high-end photographer he'd dated briefly a year ago. She had once called him her favorite muse and spent hours capturing the way light hit his features. If anyone could remind him that he was the sun, it was her. He texted her, and to his relief, she agreed to a late-night drink at a rooftop lounge, the kind of place where the lighting was designed specifically to make people like Patrick look like deities. The date Patrick arrived early, choosing a seat that framed him against the city skyline. When Elena walked in, she looked as chic as ever, her camera bag slung over her shoulder as if it were an extension of her limb. "Patrick," she said, leaning in to brush a kiss against his cheek. "You look exactly the same. It's almost eerie." "I try to keep the standard high," Patrick joked, flashing the grin that had always worked on her. "I miss this, Elena. You always knew how to appreciate the finer things." He waited for her to launch into a compliment, to tell him he looked even better than the last time she'd seen him. Instead, she set her camera on the table and looked at him with a professional, detached curiosity. "Actually, Patrick, I'm glad you called," she said, sipping her drink. "I've been moving away from portraiture. I'm doing a series on the architecture of the mundane. I've been following this incredible blog lately, this guy Anthony Miller. Do you know him?" Patrick's heart did a slow, painful somersault. "He's my best friend." "Why?" "His writing is so visceral," Elena said, her eyes lighting up in a way they never had when she was just looking at Patrick's face. "He talks about how the ugly parts of a building, the raw concrete, the exposed beams, are actually where the soul lives. It made me realize I was bored of shooting perfect things. Perfect is static. There's no story in it." Patrick looked at her, his mouth slightly open. "So, you don't want to shoot my new portfolio?" Elena laughed gently, but it felt like a serrated blade. "Oh, Patrick. You're beautiful, truly. But you're a finished product. There's nothing left to discover there. I'm looking for something with a bit more
Grit.
more depth." The rest of the date was a blur of Patrick trying to pivot the conversation back to their shared history, while Elena kept returning to the energy of Anthony's work. She wasn't being mean. She was simply uninterested in a statue. When he finally walked her to her car, she didn't ask to see him again. She just thanked him for the drink and mentioned she might reach out to Anthony for a collaboration. Patrick stood on the sidewalk, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. He realized that even his old flames were moving toward the light that Anthony was now emitting. He was left alone with his reflection, standing in front of a darkened shop window. He looked at himself, perfect, polished, and utterly bored of his own face. The cool night air bit through Patrick's expensive wool coat as he walked, his footsteps echoing against the pavement. For the first time, he wasn't looking for a taxi or a valet. He just wanted to move, to escape the suffocating feeling of being a finished product that no one wanted to buy. As he turned a corner, the scent of damp stone and old wood hit him. Nestled between two modern glass office buildings sat a small, weathered stone church. Golden light spilled from the stained glass windows, and the muffled sound of a pipe organ hummed through the heavy oak doors. Patrick stopped. He felt a magnetic pull toward the entrance, not the kind that led to a VIP booth, but a desperate need for sanctuary. He climbed the stairs, pulled open the door as quietly as he could, and slipped into the very last wooden pew. The room didn't smell like expensive perfume. It smelled of beeswax and rain. There were no flashing neon lights, only the soft flicker of prayer candles. Patrick sat huddled in his seat, his head bowed. He looked at the people around him. There were elderly couples holding hands, a young man in a tattered work jacket, and a mother shushing a fussy toddler. None of them looked at him. To them, he wasn't Patrick Tanner, the most handsome man alive. He was just another soul in a pew. At the front, a minister was speaking, her voice echoing off the high rafters. We spend our lives building monuments to ourselves. We polish the outside of the cup while the inside remains dry. But the Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. The words felt like a physical weight on Patrick's shoulders. He thought about Anthony's glowing face in the deli. He thought about his mother's voice on the phone. He realized that for years, he had been using his face as a shield to keep people from seeing that he had nothing else to offer. A woman sitting a few feet away, her face lined with age and silver hair tucked into a simple scarf, turned toward him as the congregation rose to sing a final hymn. She didn't gasp at his beauty. She didn't flirt. She simply offered him the corner of her tattered hymnal with a kind, toothy smile. The words are on page 62, dear, she whispered. Patrick took the book, his fingers trembling. He looked down at the lyrics, but his eyes were too blurred with tears to read them. He wasn't crying because he was sad. He was crying because, for the first time in his life, he felt the immense relief of being truly small. He stayed in that seat long after the service ended, and the lights began to dim, finally understanding that the underdog he had been dragging around for years wasn't Anthony, it was his own soul. The heavy oak doors of the church creaked shut behind Patrick, the sound echoing in the stillness of the midnight air. The tears had dried on his face, but the cold wind felt different now, less like an insult and more like a cleansing. He felt lighter, as if he had finally stripped off a heavy, ornate suit of armor that had been suffocating him for years. He began the walk home, not checking his reflection in the dark shop windows, but watching the way the streetlights pooled on the pavement. As he crossed the park near Anthony's neighborhood, he saw two figures silhouetted against the glow of a flickering gas lamp. They were walking slowly, their strides perfectly in sync. As they drew closer, Patrick recognized the sharp lines of Sarah's blazer and the familiar, slightly slumped shoulders of his best friend. They were holding hands, their fingers interlaced with a natural ease that Patrick had never achieved in all his years of charming women. They weren't performing for anyone. They were simply existing together in the
quiet.
Patrick stopped. A week ago, this sight would have triggered a flare of jealousy, a need to intervene and reclaim his status as the alpha. But tonight, looking at them through the lens of that small stone church, he felt a strange, warm swell of genuine joy. Anthony? Sarah, he called out, his voice steady and soft. The two jumped slightly, pulling apart. Anthony's face immediately tightened, his old defense mechanism of expecting a condescending remark from Patrick kicking in. "Pat, what are you doing out this late?" Patrick walked toward them, but he didn't puff out his chest or flash his level 4 smile. He kept his hands in his pockets and his eyes humble. I was at a service," Patrick said simply. He looked at their joined hands, then up at both of them. "I'm glad I ran into you. I wanted to apologize for earlier at the deli. I was being a fool." Sarah looked at him, her analytical eyes softening as she sensed the shift in his energy. Anthony blinked, stunned by the admission. "It's okay, man," Anthony began, but Patrick held up a hand. "No, it isn't. I've spent a long time making sure I was the only one being seen. But seeing you two tonight." Patrick looked at Sarah and then back to Anthony, giving them a small, sincere nod. "You look right together. You look like you're building something real. I just wanted to say, I'm happy for you. Truly. You both deserve that kind of light." The silence that followed wasn't the awkward, empty silence of the club. It was a moment of grace. Anthony's shoulders finally dropped, and a wide, honest grin broke across his face, the kind of look Patrick used to think was unattractive, but now realized was the most beautiful thing he'd seen all night. "Thanks, Pat," Anthony said, reaching out to give Patrick's arm a firm, brotherly squeeze. "That means a lot." Patrick watched them continue their walk, their hands finding each other again. He stood there for a moment, a handsome man in the dark, finally content to be part of the background of someone else's beautiful story. The street lamps dimmed as Patrick walked the final stretch to his apartment, the image of Anthony and Sarah fading into the night. For the first time, the silence of the city didn't feel like a lack of applause. It felt like room to breathe. He reached his door, caught his reflection in the glass one last time, and simply looked past it to the person inside. Thank you for listening. In a world that prizes the sculpture, do not forget the architect. Patrick Tanner spent his life believing that to be seen was to be loved, and that to be beautiful was to be significant. He treated his life as a gallery and his best friend as a shadow. The lesson of Patrick and Anthony is this: vanity is a shallow mirror. It can reflect your light, but it can never hold your weight. Beauty may open a door, but character is what keeps you in the room. Admiration is a fleeting vapor, but connection is a solid foundation. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less. Go forth not seeking to be a masterpiece for others to gawk at, but a craftsman of a life worth living. For in the end, the face will fade, but the soul, and the love it leaves behind, is the only structure that truly stands the test of time. You've been listening to Threads of Grace. Leave a comment if you enjoyed the story. Your comment can help our humble community grow and ensure that those who need to hear these stories will.